Welcome to the Katie Halper Show. I'm so excited to be joining you tonight, and we have a great show for you. We have joining us shortly anthropologist Jemima Pierre and historian Peter James Hudson. But before we start the show, allow me to say the following.
Okay, calm down. You got limits, man. You got limits, man. Okay, calm down.
That was our new intro. Thank you very much, Catherine Chester, for that graphic design. Thank you very much, Bradley Bloom, for that mashup of Joe Biden. Thank you, Nick Palm, for bringing it all together. Thank you, Tyler, also for helping us prepare for today's show, as always. And thank you all for joining the show. And you know what I'm going to do? I'm not too proud to beg or implore or nudge or nag. Please, if you're watching the stream, like the stream. We are dealing with an algorithmic war. Our corporate overlords are not very fond of a lot of the material that we do, a lot of the things that we cover. So it's up to us to fight back and like the stream, like these people just did. And thank you for saying it's an awesome intro. Am I echoing? Because if I'm echoing, Brad, nod. I'm echoing. Well, we were, I mean, I don't know what to say because we were on for a long time. There was definitely time. I'm going to be a little passive aggressive. There was definitely time to note the echo before. So I'm not sure what can be done. My settings are correct. And I'm already streaming. Get your friends to subscribe. Yes, says Tyler. Let me go again to settings and see if there are any options. But, oh, no, the Shure is my speaker. The Shure is my microphone. So I don't know what else to do. Someone else is saying no echo. So maybe, Brad, maybe, you know what, Brad? I hate to be that guy, not to be that guy, but it's you, not me. It actually is not me. It's you. So Brad was just testing me. He was trying to see if I could manage, if I had the wherewithal to do that intro and bask in the glory of that intro with also being thrown a hardball of an alleged echo. So everyone, it's on Brad, guys. That is the subtitle of today's show. The Katie Halper Show, Summit of the Americas, it's on Brad. But really, for reals, welcome. Everyone, please like the stream, share the stream. We got to fight back the powers that be so that we're not beaten in the algorithm by people like Pod Save America. That's not good. Or the Lincoln Project. And Brad has confirmed he figured it out. My bad. Or maybe it should be my Brad. Am I right? Hello, everyone. Okay, no, but really excited to be here. And we're about to bring on our two amazing guests. But first, Brad and I are going to chat a little bit. So Brad, come join the show. Brad Bloom.
Hey,
hi,
Katie.
Brad. How's it going?
Oh, it's going all right. I'm sorry about that false alarm there.
Yeah, really. You really were testing me there.
Yeah, and just so, unless anyone's curious, I actually had a YouTube window open in the background. And so
right.
I was...
It's the thing that I always do.
Yeah.
That I often do, yeah.
Yep.
And we urge you all to like, but also why stop at liking? Please subscribe. We're at 71,000. We got to 7.
Wow.
I shouldn't even say this, but some people have been unsubscribed, and I don't mean that they unsubscribed themselves. I mean the powers that be, like probably Mark. What I was going to call him Gutenberg.
Zuckerberg, was
Zuckerberg,
it?
Yeah, Gutenberg. What's
Wasn't
that?
That the Bible?
Yeah, with the press. Yeah, very good press system.
It's easily mistaken, confusing the two. Yeah.
Yeah. So Zuckerberg is probably responsible for that, but not even joking. Make sure you are subscribed.
I don't think that this is
have been unsubscribed.
And this is a issue that I don't think is unique to our show. This is something that I've heard complaints of across left independent media.
Oh, okay. Across left independent media. I was like, we have to make people think that they're fighting a war.
No, it's
war
absolutely
is a force that brings us together, as Chris just says. Yeah.
But
a good war. We're fighting. We're an anti-war. We're anti-war, and we're fighting a war together. Anti-war. Yeah. So, but before we start the show with our guests, we're doing a little bit just catching up. And I thought we could do something that I've done a couple times before. It's called Democracy Later. It's where we go over the headlines that Democracy Now! Brings us, but we do it a little bit later. And of course, we don't do as many. And I'm going to bring you 2 depressing things and 1 piece of good news. How's that?
Okay, great.
All right. So here's the first one. Study: 338,000 lives would have been saved during pandemic if U.S. had universal healthcare system. The lives of 338,000 people who died of COVID-19 could have been saved if the United States had a universal healthcare system. That's the finding of a new study published in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences of the United States of America. The study also estimates a universal healthcare system would have saved the United States $459 billion in healthcare costs in the year 2020. The study's lead author, Allison Galvani of the Yale School of Public Health, told Scientific American, Medicare for all would be both an economic stimulus and life-saving transformation of our healthcare system. It will cost people far less than the status quo. So, thank you for all the people who are against Medicare for all.
Yeah, and I'm just pulling this up so we can show everyone the article.
Yeah, lest you not believe me.
Yeah.
Brad wants to make sure.
Yeah. Yeah, it's. I think one thing that's interesting to point out, they were citing here the impact that the amount of people in the United States that don't have a primary care doctor and how much of a factor that is in just our insanely high death count, in this regard, because that affects not only the amount of time people will wait to get health care, but also because they haven't gotten primary care up until this point, they're already starting out in a worse position because of any amount of underlying health conditions that would make them more susceptible to infection. So it's, and then on top of that, we can go back years that even, what was it, I forget the institution, whether it was the Heritage Foundation, but it was a Koch brothers.
I think it was Rand. Yeah.
Yeah. Even their assessment of Medicare for all, even they had to admit that over a 10-year period, we're talking a savings of trillions of dollars. And I just don't think that at this point, how like when, I guess the easiest example that springs to mind would be Donald Trump would say something completely outlandish and on its face obviously false, but because he says it with a straight face, suddenly in the mainstream media, it becomes a debatable thing. Like, oh, is it true? Is it not true?
Right. Some people
no,
say.
Nobody knows. Right. That this isn't like open for debate in my mind. This question is not an open question. It could be one or the other. Clearly, both on a humanitarian or a moral or ethical perspective, but also on a financial perspective. Economic conservatives, if they're really concerned with fiscal responsibility, ironically, Medicare for all, while also being the moral and ethical position, is actually also the fiscally conservative position as well.
Right.
Yeah. And it's just some of these figures that we're talking about, over 250,000 people didn't, died that didn't have to. It's just hard to really wrap your head around. And correct me if I'm wrong, Katie, but this is another area where Joe Biden does have the ability to unilaterally make some changes here, utilizing his presidential authority in the I might be getting the names wrong here, but essentially the Emergency Provisions Act, So during a time of emergency, the president has extra
Provision.
abilities, right? That in response to, for example, the pandemic, he could announce, universal health care. And not only would that go a long way into reducing preventable death because of the pandemic, but I'd also point out for people who are really concerned about gun violence in this country, this would also cover mental health care. And so the ways in which this would improve our society are just many, many, many different angles. You want to look at this, it would be a positive thing.
Yes. No questions asked.
Yeah.
Also but you know what people are asking? People are asking how they get Bodhi emojis. And to do that, you become members at YouTube of the Katie
Medicare for All does not cover the Bodhi emojis.
It should, because that is a form of radical self-care, seeing how cute Bodhi is. We got to share some of these emojis on the screen. Yeah.
It does. It is proven to deliver a substantial amount of serotonin.
Yeah.
So there is that.
Yeah.
And I will. I don't know if I have any handy that I can show. I know that some of our YouTube members, I see some in the chat right now, so people can see. Brett is displaying them for us. And over this week, I will be supplying more Bodhi emojis.
Awesome. And of course, you can become Patreon supporters at patreon.com/The Katie Halper Show. Again, that's patreon.com/The Katie Halper Show. But we got the clock is ticking, Brad. So we got to move on to our next headline. Our next headline from Democracy Later, and that is SIPRI warns risk of nuclear war is highest since the Cold War. The Stockholm International Peace Research Institute, or SIPRI, or I guess SIPRI, is warning the risk of nuclear war is higher today than at any time since the height of the Cold War. In its annual report, SIPRI says the global stockpile of nuclear weapons is expected to soon rise for the first time in decades as the United States, Russia, China, France, and the United Kingdom move to expand or modernize their arsenals. The US and Russia possess about 90% of the world's nuclear warheads, which is what makes the media shouting for no-fly zones all the more insane.
Yeah. I, the other day, watched like a history clip on the 5 largest nuclear weapon detonations in history, and 4 out of those 5 the United States did. And we are the only country that's ever actually implemented those weapons in a actual real world scenario in Hiroshima and Nagasaki.
Right.
And so I just think that if any alarm, I'm just assuming here by what you're saying, and correct me if I'm wrong, Katie, but is the alarm or concern framed like we're concerned that this country or that country is going to be using these weapons?
You're blowing on my spot here. Literally all I have is a headline from Democracy Now! Which I've read in full.
I
Sorry.
See. No, that's fine. That's fine.
I'm just laying it on the table. I see this thing, the conceit of this was not to have an in-depth discussion.
Oh, see, I'm a novice at this.
Right. That's all I do. I literally, for this thing called Democracy Later, that's all I do.
Well, what do you think, Katie, about what was it? Jerome Powell? No, not Jerome Powell. Was it Jerome Powell?
From the Fed?
No. Secretary of Defense.
Austin.
Colin Powell.
Oh, the late Secretary of Defense.
Yeah.
Asian American.
He had a quote that garnered some attention a while ago, essentially saying that once in his career, he came to the conclusion that the nuclear weapons are useless, just because of the mutually assured destruction. Like, no one's they're a pointless weapon, because if anybody uses them, we're all screwed. So,
well, not to play devil's advocate, but that's also why people argue for them, because they prevent that.
Mm-hmm. Right.
But that's, again, so that's not going to fall under the auspices of today's discussion, which is going to be a very short thing going through headlines. But I'm glad you threw in a question about nuclear weapons and their worth, because that's a quick thing. We could definitely debate whether we should have them at all. And what else? I'm going to go on to the next one.
Yeah, so now we have a good news.
No questions, only responding, and very concisely, because we got to get on with the next show.
Got it.
I forgot that, Brad. You were like, you're great to do this, but I should have warned you, Brad. I'm going to need you to divide as much time as you normally spend by 17,000.
Right.
And obviously. Then you'll be okay. Yeah.
Yeah.
All right. Okay. Ready? Here's the good news. Bolivia, Jeanine Áñez sentenced to 10 years in prison for 2019 coup. A court in Bolivia has sentenced former President Jeanine Áñez to 10 years in prison after finding her guilty of orchestrating the 2019 coup that ousted President Evo Morales, Bolivia's first indigenous president. After the coup, Áñez served as Bolivia's president for 1 year until November 2020. Áñez, who is a former right-wing senator, was convicted of making, quote, decisions contrary to the Constitution, end quote. A former Bolivian army commander and police commander were also sentenced to jail for their role in the coup. And that is very good. And if you don't know who Jeanine Áñez is, she's a very small woman who carries a very big Bible. So that's how you can find her in a crowd. But okay, so those were that was Democracy Later, with 2 downers and 1 up. So guys, don't lose hope. There's sometimes some light at the end of the tunnel. And I think I'm going to bring in the guests, but not before using that snazzy outro thing. This is going to be a transition thing. Okay, so I'm going to play that, and Brad, you'll bring in the guests.
Great. Thanks, Katie.
Awesome. Thank you.
Okay, calm down. You got rivers, man. You got rivers, man. Okay, calm down.
Okay, and we got 1 guest. We're so excited. And we got another guest. Hey, welcome. Thank you so much for joining.
Thanks for having me.
Thanks for having me.
Yes, so fans of the show, viewers of the show will remember that we already had Jemima Pierre on. We're so excited to have her back on. Peter James Hudson is making his debut. And Jemima Pierre is the Haiti/America's co-coordinator with the Black Alliance for Peace, an editor at the Black Agenda Report, and a professor of Black Studies and Anthropology at UCLA. She's also the author of The Predicament of Blackness, Postcolonial Ghana and the Politics of Race. Peter James Hudson is Associate Professor of African American Studies and History at the University of California, Los Angeles. He is the author of Bankers and Empire, How Wall Street Colonized the Caribbean. So welcome to both of you.
Thank you.
Thanks. It's good to be here, and I loved your snazzy opening.
Oh, thank you. We just launched it, so thank you for that. And I wanted to ask both of you about because this is something that both of you cover in different ways. But the recent report from the New York Times, there was this 5-part series published by the New York Times called Ransom, which calculated just how much money Haiti had paid the French for the crime of freeing themselves from slavery. And I want to know what the most important discoveries were from that deep dive. What were not discoveries, were kind of old news for people who've been following this, but new news for other people. And also what was missing or gotten wrong.
Well, why don't I start with that question? And I would say that the first thing I would say about that piece is that I was actually surprised by how good it was coming from the New York Times, and I was surprised by how negative the reaction to it was. And in terms of the negative reaction, I saw a lot of my fellow historians were extremely upset because they felt that they weren't properly cited in the piece, and that the piece was proclaiming that it had done a bunch of new research on this so-called independence debt of Haiti and the history of that debt that in fact had been covered by North American and Haitian historians for years. That was known by most Haitian people and had been known for a while. But I would want to kind of counter that narrative of negativity about the piece and say that in the first instance, I don't think a lot of that information isn't necessarily new. Many people do know about the 1825 independence debt, and we can talk more in detail about that in particular. Many people know, and I've written about, many other historians have written about the U.S. occupation of Haiti from 1915 to 1934, and the fact that during the U.S. occupation, the Citibank or the Citigroup took over Haiti's national bank and removed $400,000 gold from the Haitian treasury and brought it to Wall Street. But what I think we don't know about that history, and what the New York Times, in my opinion, did a very good job of showing, was they really followed the money. They traced the history of that debt from 1825 really up to 2004. They showed how it amortized over time, how it was refinanced, how it was taken over, how it was first issued by the French and then taken over by the United States, how it was paid off. They interviewed descendants of the original bondholders of the debt, which I don't think I've seen anyone do before. And they tried to really demonstrate the continuity between Haiti being what people like to call the poorest country in the hemisphere, and this initial financial tax that it received for its independence, for freeing the slaves, for being the first Black republic in the hemisphere. And I think importantly, and again, this is not something that is unknown, but I think it's an important thing that was said in the New York Times. They linked the debt and discussions of repayment of the debt by France, calls for reparations from Jean-Bertrand Aristide, to the overthrow of Aristide, to the coup in 2004 that took him out. So I think that for the New York Times, who has historically been anti-Aristide, who has historically been anti-Haiti, and has contributed to a lot of negative discourse around Haiti, and contributed to the normalization of negative diplomatic relations between the United States and Haiti, to show those things to its audience, I thought was extremely important.
And can you speak more on the way that the New York Times or the legacy media in general has contributed to the, what did you just say, the poor diplomatic relations between the United States and Haiti?
Yeah, absolutely. I think in the first instance, you have to understand that when Haiti gained its independence in 1804, it meant kind of providing the first and major shock to white supremacy globally. That this is a country that was made up largely of enslaved Africans, who overthrew a plantation system. When this independence occurred, there was from the beginning of Haitian independence, there was a constant publications reporting on Haiti that basically said that these Africans, if they were free, would revert back to a stage of primitivism and atavism. They destroyed the civilization in the West, they destroyed the political economy of the West, and they were going to go back to basically the jungle. This kind of reporting, infused with negative discussions of Haitian religion, of Haitian biology, of Haitian Blackness, of Haitian violence, has suffused legacy media, Western media, since 1804 up to the present day. You know, we remember during the earthquake, the kind of discussions we saw about Haiti being cursed and this kind of thing.
David Brooks.
Exactly. The New York Times was part of that. There was, and you can see any, you know, if you're able to go into the New York Times back file, it's easy enough to find these absolutely racist representations of that. So on one level, we're looking at a kind of a massive cultural discourse that many scholars have written about, that, and I think in particular the late Michael Dash, who have portrayed Haiti in this negative light. But this cultural discourse about Haiti, this negative discourse around Haiti, has also had a policy impact. Because if you think Haiti is primitive, if you think Haitians are animals, if you think Haitians are biologically inferior, if you think that you as a white Westerner are superior to Haiti, that gives you the justification to enact any kind of policy to invade, occupy, intervene with Haitian affairs and Haitian sovereignties. And this is particularly what happened in 1915 when the US invaded. The Citibank, as well as the State Department, mobilized all these negative stereotypes of Haiti's inability to govern itself to justify a stronger power coming in. And this has gone on to justify any number of missionary groups going to Haiti. This has gone on to justify any number of NGOs, whether it's school groups or Sean Penn, who have come in and said, we can do things in Haiti better than the Haitians can. And in doing that, it's also said, well, if Haitians can't govern themselves, they don't need a state. They don't need the infrastructure. They don't need a kind of civil society. We'll redirect Red Cross money towards building a Marriott hotel. We'll redirect funds towards Sean Penn's Malibu mansion. We'll do all these other things, and the Haitian state will collapse, which will then re-justify intervention.
Right. Can you just walk people through how there was this double debt, this double burden? I think I'm not sure that most people, again, who aren't extremely tuned into this, know about how perverse it was and how kind of destined to fail Haiti was in certain ways.
Absolutely. So the double debt originates the double debt begins in 1825, but its origins are again in 1804 at the moment of Haitian independence. When Haiti becomes independent, it immediately has a diplomatic problem. This is the United States doesn't recognize it. France doesn't recognize it. Countries aren't trading with it. So how then do you build, you're trying to rebuild your internal economy, you're trying to develop trade, you're trying to develop political relations within the Caribbean, within the Americas, with Europe, and all of these major players refuse to deal with you. So Haiti, under its the President Boyer, made a deal with France where he said, look, okay, please give us recognition. And France said, yeah, we'll give you recognition, but then you have to pay us back for our losses because of the reparations. So basically, the cost of Black freedom was the price that they had to pay for the enslaved. That there was a $150 million franc loan or indemnity that France requested or imposed on Haiti in order for them to grant Haiti diplomatic recognition. And that money went to pay back slave owners effectively as well. And this is something that the New York Times found out. Some of that money did go to the French government. It wasn't just to private citizens. So the reason it becomes the double debt is because they not only did they have to pay that indemnity, but because the Haitian treasury at that time in 1825 was so depleted, they had to borrow the money from France to pay France. So it becomes a double debt in that sense. And so the interest payments on that, I mean, I think they're kind of recycled and transformed over the years. I think the original debt, according to some, is paid off by the 1870s, but the loan kind of is extended and refinanced by the Citibank in the 1920s, and then again it's finally paid off by I think 1947. But when you start to look at the kind of the interest fees, the cost of the loan, I think the New York Times, I don't have the figure right in front of me, calculated that it was between something like $10 and $100 billion of potential losses to the Haitian economy over that time. So you have, from the moment of independence, the inability for Haiti to generate an income, and that leads to Haitian underdevelopment. And then you see this long-term tax that's imposed on the country that further depletes the treasury. And again, the New York Times, I've written a lot on the U.S. occupation of Haiti and on the Citibank in Haiti. One thing the New York Times was able to do is to calculate the fact that during the U.S. occupation, something like 25% of the Haitian treasury was going to pay officers of the occupation, of the entire treasury during those years. And so, you can see this money, you can see a kind of historical pattern of money being siphoned off of the labor of Haitian peasants to pay foreign powers.
And there it's interesting because I kind of had forgotten, I think, that there were basically two removals, jumping way ahead, two removals of Aristide, who would become the president of Haiti. And they revisited this in this report. Can you also lay out for people, either one of you, why and how he was removed?
Right. I have to say the new set of critiques that came out against this, the New York Times report, is led by Michael Debert, who has written quite terribly about Haiti since the late in the late 1990s, but especially around Aristide. So they wrote an open letter basically saying that the New York Times misrepresented the U.S. government's relationship with Aristide, and basically said Aristide was this monster that they created, that they made him out to be back in 2002, 2003, right before. But one of the key things to me is the fact that the New York Times actually acknowledges that this was a coup d'etat against Aristide, which most of us knew, right? If the WikiLeaks papers revealed this, so no matter what Michael Debert, and who's reporting on Haiti, to me is extremely problematic and really racist in terms of how he represents the dark-skinned Haitians and especially the Aristide supporters. I have to say that because it's really problematic, and so Michael Debert was really the local, I guess, the Western journalist spokesperson for the elite, the opposition against Aristide and the working class people. But the point is, in 2004, I think it's important to talk about, because it is 2004 is the 200th anniversary of the Haitian independence, and it was really I think it is on purpose that they picked that timing to remove Aristide from power, and he was removed, and he was kidnapped. But before I talk about that briefly, what's important is that January 2000 and late January, early February 2003, there's something called the Ottawa Initiative. And I don't know if people talk about that, where Canada, France, and the US, and this is the liberal government of Canada, Jean Chrétien, right? And organizes a 2-day conference in Ottawa. Basically, it's about, and it was a secret conference that was later reported by a magazine like Charité in Quebec. It's basically saying that there's discussions including the need to remove Aristide and the need for a potential trusteeship over Haiti. So this is January 2003. And then you have in April 2003, you have Aristide announced on the anniversary of the death of Toussaint Louverture, which is one of the leaders of the Haitian Revolution, that France needs to pay reparations. And to him, and this is 2003, he said the equivalent was $21 billion, $21.6 billion in terms of current what the amount would mean currently. And so he did that. And then later on in that year, October 2023, he actually had a 4-day conference in the National Palace of Haiti with international scholars and historians to actually talk about this, what it's meant to go after these funds that France basically took from Haiti. So this is all in the lead up to, the coup d'etat against Aristide, where you have the use of the National Endowment for Democracy, which is the CIA soft power wing, funding so-called student movements. And I have to say quickly, one of the students that were funded by the NED became prime minister, right? Claude Joseph, right before, right when Jovenel Moïse was assassinated last year, almost a year ago. So I have to, so you have all these student groups, supposed student groups funded by the IRI, the International Republican Institute, and the National Endowment for Democracy. You also have a group of the Haitian elite led by Andre Apede, which are these white and Levantine elites, who they're called the Group 184, who were really made up intellectuals and business people who really hated Aristide and hated the grassroots support that he had. And so you have these, you have the U.S. supporting this, and so it looks like there are these protests against Aristide, and there were protests, but then there are counter protests, and so you have to pay attention to how the press reported it. So if you follow the way the New York Times, in particular, and all these Western presses report this, it's as if there's this huge uprising against Aristide. this paramilitary is about to take over the capital and so on and so forth, when the reality was actually something very different. They were building it up and they were preparing the way to take him out. And they land, so they land in Haiti, the Marines, and people will tell you this, they land and they show up to his house, to Aristide's house, and then they tell him he has to pack his things and go. And then they put him and his wife, the U.S. ambassador at the time, I forgot his name, Dennis, if I remember correctly, I forgot his name. I'll remember it a little. Yeah. So he, so they show up at the house, and they said that he needs to leave. He needs to leave, and so they escort him to a plane. Him and his family.
Terry
and his
Buchar?
Huh?
Terry Buchar?
No,
sorry.
Well, no, it wasn't. It's James Foley, U.S. Ambassador James Foley, showed up, and then at the same time, James Foley picks up the Chief Justice from his house and say, "You're about to be made president," right? And so part of that, we have to know the role of the U.S. government is. So you have the U.S. ambassador in the middle of the night going to pick up the Chief Justice and take him to the National Palace as the U.S. Marines are putting Aristide and his family, on a plane, and then they fly and then they land somewhere in the Caribbean, and then Prime Minister of P.J. Patterson was Prime Minister of Jamaica and also head of CARICOM, at this point is saying, we will take Aristide and give him asylum. Then you have Condoleezza Rice calling Jamaica and all these places and saying you cannot have him. And WikiLeaks files also say that there are all these things that say we cannot have Aristide in the hemisphere. So, so with all of that, they fly him to the Central African Republic, where this military official had just taken over and was looking for regularized relationships with the U.S. So the U.S. convinced him to take, to take this plane. So they land after flying for hours, not knowing where they are, ironically being taken back to Africa, right? And it was so this was the coup d'etat. And by the time they removed Aristide, the U.S. and Canadian militaries already had hundreds of officers on the ground in Haiti. So they were already planning for this. And we have to know this. And then George W. Bush sent a U.S. so-called stabilizing mission. And then through the Security Council, the U.S. and France convinced the Security Council to allow a Title VII UN occupation, which is a military occupation of Haiti, that basically they could use force. And so what you have from the end of February, when they remove Aristide from office, you have thousands and thousands of people being killed by both the foreign forces, but also those who were against Aristide. And so that's really the story that gets lost, because the 2004 coup d'etat is really the beginning of the end of the Haitian state. Because at this point, what we have is a complete destruction of Haitian political society. I think there are like 3 or 4 elected officials left out of thousands. And then you have like the complete dismantling of Haitian sovereignty with this 2004 coup d'etat. And I think that's an important thing. And they're very much linked to Aristide asking for reparations back in 2003.
And if I could just add one quick thing to that, I think one of the things that the New York Times did that was important is they interviewed one of the French ministers at the time, where he basically said, yes, Aristide was removed in part for his call for reparations. We've never seen any French official admit that in the past. I think that's extremely important, just to add a kind of exclamation point on Jemima's comment.
Did they have to ply him with drinks? I mean, I was kind of impressed that someone would admit to that. I guess
it's the arrogance of some of these officials, I think.
Because exactly, they're arrogant enough to get away with it, and no one will complain because it's Haiti.
Right.
Sorry, keep going.
Well, no, and I think that's important, and no one will complain about it because it's Haiti, or they'll look at the wrong issues here. And so again, the you asked at the beginning of the show, well, what was missing from the New York Times piece? And I think that what the New York Times did was give us, in a way that the New York Times never does, it gives us a bunch of openings to think about the U.S. and Haiti, to think about Haiti, to think about foreign debt, to think about military intervention and occupation. I saw many people complaining that they didn't do the proper footnoting, and that became the discourse. And it's in some ways a bit sad to me that the series, which I think everyone should read critically, has already kind of moved away from the headlines within a week. Like it didn't gain the traction that I think it deserved to have.
And any critiques from your perspective, more from the left, let's say?
Jemima, can I jump in again here? I would say a couple of things. I think my critique is, in some ways, it's not a critique, because I'm not sure if this is necessarily the mission or the purview of what the New York Times should do. But what they don't talk about in the piece is that when Citibank is in Haiti in 1915, and they're involved in the United States occupation of Haiti, they call for occupation, the landing of troops in Haiti. This is not an exceptional moment in the Caribbean in this period. This is the high era of dollar diplomacy, where you have Nicaragua is described as the Republic of Brown Brothers because of their presence in the country, and they call for troops in Nicaragua. You have in Cuba, not only is Citibank deeply involved in Cuba, but the Chase Manhattan Bank, now JP Morgan Chase Bank One, is involved in the Machado government and is involved in lending huge amounts of money to the Machado government, knowing that Machado is butchering political opponents, and that the Cuban people are starving, and that they're never ever going to be able to pay back this debt. They're in the Dominican Republic. They're in they're all throughout the region. So I think I wish the New York Times had opened up that kind of window to really talk about this, not as exceptional to Haiti or exceptional to Citibank, but part of Wall Street in the Caribbean and Latin America during this period in a whole range of fashions. The other thing I wish that they had, in terms of this question of reparations, we have to be clear that that obviously the Haiti paid reparations to France, but this is something that's going on throughout the Caribbean after slavery. Puerto Rico in 1871, when they abolished slavery, the Spanish spent I think 70 million pesetas that they gave to the slaveholders in Puerto Rico. Some of those slaveholders own the Barrilito Rum Company, which was just sold a couple of weeks ago. So that money is still circulating. Right before the New York Times piece on Haiti came through, we saw some prince and princess of England floating through the Caribbean to celebrate the Queen's Jubilee, and one of the calls there was for reparations for slavery. That in the British West Indies, again, slave owners in England were paid millions of dollars for the loss of their property at abolition, and some of that money, some of the debt, those debt payments were only finished in 2015. And so it's unfortunate to me that this amazingly researched piece wasn't able to open up a broader conversation around reparations and a broader conversation around US and European imperialism in the Americas.
Was there anything that could have been done or could still be done in terms of, because I was thinking about this when I was rereading the piece today. It's like, well, what could Haiti have done? I mean, they fought for their independence, right? They overthrew slavery, and then France comes with boats, with ships. What was there any way out of this? Was there any way? I'm not like victim. I'm not blaming Haiti. I'm just more like from a perspective of internationalist moving forward. Because whether it's back then or the more recent debt, or we see this in other countries that are, like there's a gun to their heads, whether it's through gunboat diplomacy or through debt, structural adjustment, like what can be done? I know this is a kind of overwhelming question, but do you have any ideas about that?
I would say in
international revolution, or
well, I mean, I think that's still to be done. But I think in 1825, I mean, remember how many countries in the hemisphere have abolished slavery? All of Haiti's neighbors, slavery still exists.
Right.
And so you're fighting against you're this small, brand new, broken, poor country fighting against the entire world. At this point,
yeah.
I don't know if they had any choices. I do think that we also have to take a fine, a look at the debates within the Haitian elite that cause certain kinds of divisions. And one of the things I think that's important to understand is, and Jemima can speak to this in ways that I can't, but the division between light and dark in Haiti, and what that means in terms of class formation and the formation of the Haitian state in the 19th century, and the betrayal of the African masses by a light-skinned elite, which then enables international powers to kind of come in and do what they want, and which is a problem that still happens today. So I think, in the first instance, I would say what could have been done differently. Well, the mulattoes might not have betrayed their African brothers and sisters, and that might have led to something else.
Right, or their mothers, right? And so part of that is I think you're absolutely right. I was going to say that, and one of the things that actually just reading Gerald Horne always reminds me that the counter-revolution begins as soon as the revolution itself begins, right? And so there's a reason why Haiti is really considered the longest neo-colonial experiment in the hemisphere, because from the very beginning, the counter-revolution, the Europeans, the Westerners were so upset and so angry at that. They went everywhere. They went after Haiti. So even after losing, they would surround, the US in particular, and France would surround the island over and over again and threaten more invasions and so on. But I do think what Boyer did by taking up that loan, by begging the French for recognition, is really a problem. And I think that's something I think we don't talk enough about Haiti in terms of the mulatto elite. And they're not all mulatto, but there's the Southern elite. I don't know if we know, there was a civil war in Haiti, right? The North versus the South after independence, after the fight for the revolution. And then you have Dessalines, who was in the North, especially with the larger part of the Black masses, was assassinated. And that's only when Boyer was able to come in then and try to unify the country. But there's this lingering conversation that needs to be had about the mulattoes need to always go to France and have that kind of white recognition. And I do think we're paying for that to this day. And the people against Aristide, the people against all these mass movements have always been these elites, right? The mulatto elite who can't stand the mulatto in these days. Now we have more the Levantine elite, the Italians, the Biggio, these 10 or 12 families that continue to run Haiti. And then they continue to see the Haitian people as less than. They can see the masses of the dark-skinned folks as less than. And if we don't talk about that, and we don't talk about that in terms of continuous contemporary politics, then we lose out a large part of the story. And that's the other thing for me. I think all these academics who are so angry about not being cited in the story, they love to talk about old Haiti. They like to talk about the Haitian Revolution, like the details of the revolution. What was? Oh, sorry, that's my loud child. What was going on? Military strategy by Dessalines and so on and so forth. Because there's a whole new, there's a new like Haitian revolutionary studies thing that's taken off in academia. But part of that is that there's a fetishizing of the Haitian Revolution in very particular ways, but nothing about what happens after the revolution. And a lot of these people don't condemn U.S. and French and Canadian imperialism, don't condemn the fact that the U.S. is Haiti is being run now by the core group, which is a group of European countries, and that make all the decisions. Don't condemn the fact that there's a de facto unelected so-called leader in Haiti. That's all part of this long history, and a lot of these academics don't acknowledge that, and they take on the U.S. imperial views of Haiti and demonize, the priest Aristide, but don't really challenge U.S. imperialism in the country.
There's somebody in your chat who made a funny off-the-cuff comment that we should invade Citibank. And to some degree, I think they have a point. And one thing that we need to recognize is right now, Citigroup about a year ago announced that they're undergoing what they're calling a racial equity audit, which is what they're doing, a kind of forensic analysis of their own ledger sheet to show how they may have contributed to discrimination in lending and housing. And my question is, well, if they're willing to do a racial equity audit, based on the kind of their domestic policies, why not open that up geographically and historically? To this day, Citibank has never made a public statement on the U.S. occupation. They didn't from 1915 to 1934. They haven't opened their archives up to researchers. They didn't open them up to the New York Times, and we don't know actually what's in those archives and what more might be there. But we have to understand that Citibank in particular, some of their roots are with slave owners in Cuba, with slave owners in Texas before they get to Haiti. We also know that Citibank was profiting from apartheid for 30 or 40 years. They were the last U.S. bank to pull out of South Africa. We also know from the Nader report on Citibank, published in the early 1970s, that they were fleecing low-income communities in New York City for years, paying them lower, reinvesting their savings in richer neighborhoods, discriminating against women, Latinos, and Blacks. And so I think that in terms of what can be done now, that we need to demand that real racial equity audit and demand reparations, or as your listener said, invade Citibank.
Yeah. Yeah, can organize the troops right from here. Well, this makes the next thing I want to talk about, which was the Sum of the Americas, all the richer of a discussion. Because what we're going to talk about now is I thought we could start by watching a short clip, if that's okay. People probably know that the Summit of Americas wrapped last week, and it was hosted by the United States and held in LA. And Biden excluded Cuba, Nicaragua, and Venezuela, and that led to a kind of embarrassing for the United States boycott on the parts of the presidents of Bolivia, Honduras, Guatemala, and El Salvador, and Mexico. So AMLO didn't come. And we have a clip of Biden's press secretary, Karine Jean-Pierre, being asked about AMLO not coming to the summit. So let's play that clip.
Given the people who are not going to the summit, President of Mexico, President of Honduras, who the Vice President recently spoke directly to, what does it say about the strength of U.S. influence in the region of these people deciding they don't want to go?
Yeah, let me just speak to the President of Mexico very quickly, because I have something in there for you. We have had candid engagement with President López Obrador, as well with other regional partners, for more than a month regarding the issue of invitations to the summit. It is important to acknowledge that there are a range of views on this question in our hemisphere, as there are in the United States. The president's principled position is that we do not believe that dictators should be invited, which is the reason that the president has decided not to attend. We look forward to hosting Foreign Secretary Ebrard as the Mexican representative, and we welcome Mexico's significant contribution to the summit, to the major summit deliverables. President Biden and the First Lady look forward to welcoming President Obrador and the First Lady of Mexico to Washington in July for a bilateral visit. At that meeting.
By the way, July, just have to interject, July, of course, is the same month that Biden, who doesn't like dictators, as she just said, Biden will be going to Saudi Arabia in July to meet with the not so democratically elected Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman. But
President Biden and President Obrador will have the opportunity to carry the work forward for the summit. To your actual question, I just wanted to make sure I dealt with Mexico, because we had a little announcement there. The U.S. remains the most powerful force in driving hemispheric actions to address core challenges facing the people of the Americas: inequality, health, climate, and food security. And so the president continues to be a leader in the hemisphere.
So there you have it. That's why these governments were not invited, because the United States hates dictatorship.
Right. And so then I'm trying to figure out how Dr. Ariel Henry, the unelected so-called prime minister of Haiti, who's implicated in the assassination of Haiti's president, not only got invited, but also took pictures with Biden and his wife, and was very much part of this discussion. And the truth is, the U.S. is a very big power in the region, in destabilizing the region, in installing dictators, and creating a completely undemocratic region, and also through its bullying, right? Using the OAS and so on and so forth. And so, we at the Black Alliance for Peace actually called for a boycott of the summit because the U.S. had no right to have any kind of leadership in this region because of its actions. And to me, the summit was an embarrassment and really demonstrates a major imperial decline in the region. And the fact that these small countries were able to, turn down, go against. A lot of them came, but a lot of people, these 6, I think, countries that didn't come represent about 200 million people in the region, but that's a large number of people. And I think it's important that they didn't show up. And I think, to me, in the future, I don't think the Summit of Americas I think in the future, the Summit of the Americas will probably get fewer people attending. And I think it's great that people are standing up for the exclusion of Nicaragua, Cuba, and Venezuela.
Yeah. It's really embarrassing also because I guess since AMLO wasn't coming, Biden was very eager to make sure it was a full event and he wanted to have people in attendance. So he had to send a special envoy to invite Jair Bolsonaro, the president of Brazil, who is probably the most authoritarian leader of all of Latin America, the most Trumpian. He even said he subscribes to the big lie theory, and he said that Biden's election was suspicious, and Biden had to go out of his way to invite him. And he was so desperate to invite him that there were reports that Bolsonaro demanded certain concessions to go, like not being criticized, not being asked about deforestation. So I wanted to show one more clip where Biden's poor press secretary has to take another question. So here she is, interestingly enough, being asked about Bolsonaro, the president of Brazil. You'll see why it's interesting that was a question when she answers.
It's not a different subject. The president's meeting with President Bolsonaro of Brazil. The AP is reporting that the Brazilian government, President Bolsonaro, wanted specific concessions from the president for that meeting, and for his attendance at the Summit of the Americas, that he wouldn't bring up. Bolsonaro's casting doubts about Brazil's election system, as well as environmental concerns in the Amazon. Can you confirm that report?
I cannot confirm that report. The president is looking forward to leaving tomorrow to head to the summit that we are hosting. I can say this: the United States continues to recognize Juan Guaido as the interim president of Venezuela. That said, while the interim government was not invited to participate in the main summit, they are welcome to participate in all 3 stakeholder forums and other events.
So not sure why she went from Brazil to Venezuela, but maybe it's in the spirit of internationalism and anti-nation state borders. I don't think it's that, but that was interesting, and it was kind of sad to see her embrace Guaido as she calls him. It's pretty pathetic because he wasn't even invited to be a major player because of course he's not the president. But
right, but I want to say 2 things. In the second part will be about the speaker herself, but I do think it's of course having Juan Guaido, who was beat up by people in Venezuela just 2 days ago. It's all over the news, and where you have Blinken and Brian Nichols, calling him, one of them called him the president, the other one called him the interim president. And so this is a big farce, right? The so-called democracy summit, where you're claiming that a person does not even hold office, was not elected, you're claiming that that's the president of Venezuela, which itself, is ridiculous, especially since just a month ago you flew down, sent your representatives to go beg Maduro for oil. After sanctioning Russia. So there's that. But I also, I find it really distressing, the number of Black people being the face of the U.S. empire. And Caroline Jean-Pierre in particular, because she's Haitian American. And the fact that the U.S. government's treatment of Haiti is so terrible and so racist. And I also want to point to the fact that, since September, Biden has deported almost 30,000 Haitians. There's a deportation flight every day, leaving here, taking people back to Haiti. And so you have this terrible treatment of Haiti by the U.S. government, by Biden. Then you have this Haitian American press secretary claiming that Juan Guaido is the president of Venezuela, and making all these statements about these unelected, undemocratic leaders in the region, to me is just really jarring. It's the same with having Brian Nichols, who's the Black American who's in charge of the Western Hemisphere in the State Department. The same as jarring as having Lloyd Austin as the head of the Pentagon, as jarring as Linda Thomas Greenfield as head of the UN. All of these Black people.
I feel some of that too with Greenfield.
Right. Spouting all this, these terrible, really anti-Black imperialist points, talking points for the U.S. government. And so the U.S. can hide behind these Black faces, which makes it, very difficult to watch. But we definitely, nevertheless, need to condemn these people and their participation in pushing for the empire.
Yeah. And then I know you've been so generous with your time. We've gone over a little bit, but could you give like a very short, well, of course, Peter, if you have anything to say about the summit. And then I also wanted to ask you, Jemima, to just say something about Colombia.
Well, let me say very quickly, I thought the summit was a joke. I thought it was embarrassing. I thought it was marked by a kind of diplomatic petulance on the part of the Biden administration that I don't think went over well with anybody, even those people who attended, other than Guaido and Bolsonaro. I also think that this is the summit was overshadowed by two crises. And one is a domestic crisis that, with inflation that we're seeing here, with the ongoing spate of gun violence that makes the U.S. look like it's about to collapse itself, and Biden trying to deny those things, but also the fact that since the operations in Ukraine started, the United States is looking increasingly crazy and at the same time isolated on the international stage. That a lot of people don't support what Biden is doing in the Ukraine and the war with Russia, and people throughout the Caribbean, throughout the Americas, are experiencing the blowback of that. First of all, just in the cost of the price of food. And so if you look at the agenda of the Summit of the Americas, the key things that matter to people in the region were not dealt with in a substantial way. They brought up questions of global warming, but didn't address the fact that the Pentagon is the largest emitter of CO2s. They barely brought up the questions of food security that are going to lead to serious problems of populations being able to feed themselves in the Americas, especially when food supplies are controlled by companies like Monsanto and other US corporations. They didn't bring up the kind of flooding of many of these countries from Jamaica to Haiti to Mexico with American weapons and what that's done to destabilize people. They didn't bring up, as Jemima pointed out, the kind of questions of immigration that are brought on by these questions of imperial stabilization. And they didn't bring up the fact that many Caribbean states are failing, as they like to say, largely because of US imperial policy. And so this was a kind of diplomatic carnival that was ultimately meaningless. But if you scratch the surface behind it, you see a real problem with US hegemony in the region. And I think the US can't go back at this point.
Right. And I wanted to just quickly say one of the good things that happened with the people's with the Summit of the Americas is the fact that there were 3 different anti-summits, right? So we had an anti-imperialism summit, which is the weekend before the People's Summit, which was all these grassroots organizations in the California area, from Unión del Barrio, Black Alliance for Peace, and Bayon, all these organizations of people of color coming together and having their own events, like 2 sets of events. That, and then of course the People's Summit, which I think got a lot of play. There's also a workers' summit that happened in Tijuana, that included the countries that were left out. So what it did allow the space for all these anti-summit people, grassroots organizations, to come together and have our own conversations outside of this farce. Right? So, and so I guess I got to talk just quickly about Colombia. I was part of a delegation of 29 mostly Black women, the largest delegation of Black women election observers in the history of Colombia. We went to witness the elections that took place on May 29th. This just 2 weeks ago. And the reason we went is because I don't know if your listeners know, but the two leading candidates are part of the leftist Pacto Histórico party, where Gustavo Petro, who's a former guerrilla activist turned mayor of Bogota, and Francia Marquez, who is an Afro-Colombian woman activist. And since they led, once they were running, they were the leading party out of seven parties running. They were really receiving a lot of death threats. They were, even though they were leading by the polls. And so in a country of a long history of right-wing rule, it was important for us to make sure that we were able to go and observe these elections. And so the group of us went to Cali and Buenaventura, and we split, and we basically went to various different places where the elections were happening. And we saw a lot of irregularities, particularly irregularities around, certain places had more militarized, the military presence were in the poorer and Blacker and browner neighborhoods, whereas the wealthier parts only had maybe a couple police. And so we saw that. We saw the intimidation. We saw some places had biometric machines, like the wealthier places had biometric machines, the poorer places didn't. And so part of that was just to make sure we have these, point out these irregularities, but also make sure that people had access to votes, especially in the poorer Black areas where there's been a lot of intimidation because they're afraid that the poor people will vote for the Pacto Histórico ticket. And so the result of the election was that it was Petro's party did not get the 50%, but they got an overwhelming majority. And then the second two parties, I think they got 40-something percent, 42% or so. And then the other two parties that came close were one with 28% and one with 24%. And so then there's a runoff between this extremely Trump-like candidate who came from out of nowhere. I think his name is Hernandez, and through his TikToks or whatever, but his old billionaire Trump-like guy versus this Pacto Histórico, which is a coalition of leftist parties. And so now the runoff is this weekend on the 19th, and so we're keeping our fingers crossed that all will go well.
Yeah, we had Ali Vargas and Camila Escalante come on and talk about that. But I definitely am glad to hear from you about what you witnessed, because they weren't there. They gave their perspective, their very informed perspective from Bolivia.
Right.
But great. You'll have to send me photos if you have any.
Yeah, we have a lot. Yeah, definitely.
Great. Well, thank you so much for your time. Any final statements that you want to share or plugs?
I want to say shout out to my man Clifton Joseph up in Toronto, who's tuning in right now.
Yeah,
Peter's a Canadian. Always.
I could tell. Yeah, I could tell the whole time. I was biting my tongue. Toronto, right? That makes. Are you from Toronto?
Vancouver.
Oh, Vancouver. It's funny. I wouldn't have thought that. I would have thought you were from or the Toronto area. I co-host with Aaron Mate on one of my shows, but he doesn't really have an accent. Not really.
To get rid of it?
I guess he did. Yeah, he worked very hard to get rid of it. Yeah.
Yeah. But I wanted to just quickly say I do think so. I do think people should take the time and read the New York Times report story in Haiti, but also read all the stuff that came out. There's a list of there's a bibliography. I think Peter, you could talk about that briefly. Just how they documented all this stuff. But I also think people need to pay attention to what's going on in Haiti now, read about what's going on currently. We publish a lot about Haiti in the Black Agenda Report. And of course, we have a whole Haiti Americans team with the Black Alliance for Peace. And so I do think that there's a crisis in Haiti right now. There's a crisis of government. Haiti to me, is a colony. There's no government. There's no time for vote. No one's talking about elections. And that was the thing that was saddening to me about being in Colombia, is the fact that they can actually have elections. And whereas in Haiti, there's no elections because the US, France, and Canada basically dismantled the Haitian state. And I think that's an important thing for us to remember, that the Haitian state is no longer a self-functioning state. That the Ottawa Initiative, in terms of having like this this government that they wanted to put in place, it basically succeeded. And so we're hoping for another revolution.
And I would add to that I think Jemima's right. The New York Times did publish an extensive bibliographical essay where they were very deliberate in listing all of their archival and journalistic and academic sources that they used. They via GitHub, they actually published or uploaded a lot of their archival materials, and I think people should make use of that to extend or critique the New York Times. I also think it's important to acknowledge that the Black Alliance for Peace has compiled something like a 40-page Haiti America syllabus that really brings a lot of these questions of Haiti and U.S. imperialism up to date in the present, and that's available through the Black Alliance for Peace website. And I'd really encourage people to take a look at that, to read those articles, to share it with your friends and neighbors in Canada or wherever it is, and just be informed. I mean, I think education is the one thing we really need right now.
And I'm also going to plug this book right here, Bankers and Empire, How Wall Street Colonized the Caribbean, by none other than our distinguished guest. I started reading it. It's very good.
It's a great book.
I would recommend. Yeah, it's really good. Very, it gets you from the beginning, which is not,
yes.
Can't say that about all books.
Right, especially a book about bankers, right?
Yeah, I know, seriously. I was like, oh God, here I go. I'm going to have to try to pay attention, have a lot of coffee, but it was great. Yeah, so hard recommend, yeah.
Thank you for that.
Of course. And thank you guys so much for coming on. Come back. We loved having you.
Thanks so much for having me. Yeah.
Thanks for having us.
Bye. Okay, that was great, everyone. Wow. I feel very blessed by those two guests. Very excited that we had them on. Also, I have to apologize. I said that Honduras was boycotting the summit. Xiomara Castro was threatening to boycott, and I think she ultimately did not boycott it. But yes, thank you so much again to Peter, James Hudson, and Jemima Pierre. That was great. Really like that. Brad, you want to come back? I have a couple of announcements to make. One is I just got to remind people to become Patreon supporters. That show was so important. It's going to be all public, no Patreon only from that, because they both spoke about such important things that don't get enough attention. So that this whole show is going to be public, but of course you can still support it at Patreon, patreon.com/The Katie Halper Show. And it's worth becoming Patreons because there's so much other great Patreon only content. So what do we got? We're going to have a Michael Hudson interview soon. Richard Wolff. It's a great interview that I did with Richard Wolff. It's both like about politics, but it's also about personal stuff. It's so interesting. In fact, another time I'm going to play a clip of it. A little short segment. We got Susan Sarandon, a long chat with Susan Sarandon, and we're going to have some Roger Waters coming soon down the pike. And thank you again, to everyone who came, who's in the audience, to our guests, to Brad, to Tyler. All right, Katie Halper Show family. We will see you next week.
Bye.
Bye, everyone.